Hello, happy Friday, everyone. Welcome to the Wall Street Blockchain Alliance's Crypto Roundup, Friday, March 7th, 2025. Ron Quaranta here with my amazing co-host Josh Klayman and the man behind the curtain himself, David Brill, probably calling from his yacht someplace. Before we begin, again, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. If you have questions for Josh or David or I, please feel free to put them in the chat. LinkedIn Live, Twitter as well, and we will also be recording and posting to Spotify. Before we begin, you probably all saw the disclaimer, but obviously nothing the three of us are discussing is any type of advice, legal, investment, or otherwise. And then everything we're discussing really are our own personal opinions, don't necessarily represent the opinions of our individual firms. David, Josh, another remarkable week has gone by. Let's start off with the news because there's no point in putting together an agenda for us on a week-to-week basis. Josh, you and I and David saw the news yesterday. The president signed an executive order for strategic Bitcoin reserve, and Bitcoin immediately fell out of the bed and collapsed something like over 2%. David, Josh, were you excited by the news? Was it a surprise? And are you surprised by the reaction from the marketplace?
Ron, I think it's very clear that, when you have a stock announcement, there's an immediate response when a stock is, whether it's earnings or some special news. And I think that there's been so much damage over the past couple of years and sort of negativity that if any news doesn't come out exactly how people expect it, it's like rush to hit the sell button. And I was at the ABA White Collar Conference last night, and I kept getting these alerts, down 5,000. I think you texted me and somebody else texted me. So I really think people are just like a little button heavy and don't really get a chance to digest it and just make a decision and either buy or sell. And most of the time it's sell.
Josh, go ahead.
So I think, not that I have a crystal ball of any sort, but it does make me wonder if maybe some of the changes in, the movement had to do with the fact that ultimately the reserve was just Bitcoin. Right. So we certainly saw an effect on other tokens that had been potentially named as contenders for being part of the reserve as opposed to a stockpile.
Yeah.
Right. And I do wonder whether that could have, I don't know. I was going to say bled onto Bitcoin's price, but that sounds really horrible.
Dark. But David, Josh, to that point, and Josh, I'm with you. I think the three of us thought exactly the same thing. And for everyone in the audience, when you text David and David's at an event and you want to talk about the markets, he immediately tells you, I'm at an event. And then a moment later you see, I'm going to take a look at this. So you know David's always plugged in. David, Josh, I think the interesting thing about the announcement was, the unrealistic expectations. And one of the things I point out there, if you read the announcement, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, it was only for quote unquote confiscated Bitcoin through prior law enforcement actions. Essentially, David is assuming the fact that the government would not be quote unquote buying Bitcoin. Was that the drag, and were people really expecting more?
So, you know what, Ron, I think a lot of people have misinterpreted what the EO says, because I actually think that as long as it's in a revenue neutral position, the government can buy Bitcoin for the strategic reserve. And so I think that's the nuance that's been missed by a lot of people. I also think it's important to note that, I think it was approximated that we've lost about 17 or $18 billion in a potential appreciation because we've been selling it somewhat haphazardly. The Bitcoin that we've confiscated. So look, I think this is a win-win. I think it's giving Bitcoin and other digital assets in the future a status within the country. I think that, tactical purchases of Bitcoin would be positive, and it's just saying it needs to be done in a revenue neutral way. And ultimately, I don't think any of us really want us to, print more dollars to buy Bitcoin. I mean, some of our degen friends might like that, but, all kidding aside, I think in a revenue neutral way is a positive thing. And we're in debt right now, and I don't know that we should be printing money to buy Bitcoin right now.
Josh, go ahead.
Yeah, and when you guys talk about expectations, right? It's pretty amazing how high the expectations have gotten. Like if you think back a year or two from now, sitting last March or the March before, or, in 2020, 2023
Right,
in
right.
March, could we have imagined that we would have a strategic Bitcoin reserve? Like, it seems that as more has happened, expectations have continued to rise. So I do think some of it is, um, we should really take a step back and see how far we've come.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Josh, because you brought up 2023. In 2023, the three of us on text messages were like, crypto's doomed in the US, the government absolutely hates it. Now we're talking about a strategic Bitcoin reserve, and there's this kind of rubber band effect of expectations. But I want to layer something onto the conversation as well, Josh, which was, we've been talking strategic Bitcoin reserve, but other cryptos were added to the dialogue. And one of the things, that markets generally don't like, David, you and I chat about this all the time, is that uncertainty. Josh, when you saw the news about things like XRP or Cardano and other cryptos being part of government, they're not part of reserves now, but being part of what the government operates in from a crypto perspective, is that a wise approach for the government? And were you surprised at some of the backlash to that?
So, I mean, I wasn't surprised by the backlash because,
Right.
as we know, like the crypto space, it's all one crypto space, and yet it's many ecosystems and different groups. So that doesn't surprise me.
Right.
It also didn't necessarily surprise me the selection of potential tokens. If
Why?
you think about the backgrounds of many of the huge supporters or people whose names were floated, I mean, I think it's important to remember, for example, like as I understand it, although all caveats apply, like David O. Sachs was an investor in the seed round of Solana,
Right.
right? The Trump coin and Melania coins, again, Solana. And when we were thinking about who might become the AI and crypto czar, though I don't think we knew it would be an AI and crypto czar at this point, Charles Hoskinson's name had been floated, right? And so is Cardano such a big surprise? No. I mean, certainly with XRP and Ripple and the ongoing cases and all that stuff, and the fact that there actually is actual case law saying that certain transactions in XRP are certainly not transactions in securities.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think if you look at it that way, or ETH, right?
Right.
ETH, as opposed, like, as the silver to Bitcoin's gold, which it often has been compared to over the years. I think it's not surprising what was contemplated to potentially be in there. But I do think if we think about who some of the key supporters, that if I'm making things like even more ratcheted up that way, and I don't want to take anyone's name in vain, but I would just note, like, there were a lot of Bitcoin maxis, right, including from the Puerto Rico contingent, who got Trump to speak at the Nashville conference, right, or who sponsored that and really rolled out the idea. Although my recollection is that RFK Jr. also had provided some commentary beforehand, but as part of Trump's speech. So I think, like, the David Billies of the world and others, again, all caveats apply. David Bailey runs, the Bitcoin conference. These folks and many others who are deep in Bitcoin, I think they have powerful voices, and they did a lot to help Trump win the election.
Josh, to that point, yes, the crypto ecosystem is nothing if not opinionated. David, when you look at when you listen to some of the comments that Josh has made, and I fully agree, the cynic might argue that some of what's being raised as potential government strategic reserves, or how government will be involved in crypto, is a little bit of inside baseball. Is that too cynical a perspective?
Look, I don't think so. And look, I think a lot of people who are invited to this event today are people who were big donors, and this is a thank you. And and you know what? There's nothing wrong with that. It may not include everybody we think of as should be included, but look, I think this is part of DC, and as you know, we've been to DC a lot, and we're very plugged in, that this is a common happening. So I'm not surprised at all. You also have to remember that we have sort of an America first viewpoint in the world right now, and so I think tokens that get chosen, will reflect that. I mean, I do think that the tribalism within our community does come out as far as who's getting invited and, and what tokens are being considered. I do have to say sometimes it does have a sort of high school feel to things. But ultimately, look, there are a lot of donors here that have been invited, and I'm not surprised really by the choices. And I think the dialogue around which crypto assets will be considered outside of Bitcoin and ETH will be, it'll be a fluid conversation.
David,
And,
is the reason you're off camera because you're actually at the White House? Josh and I are curious if you were invited.
No, I was a last minute invite, so I'm on a plane now going to DC. No. It's just I'm having an unfortunate camera glitch. But look, there are going to be more of these, and I think there'll be more opportunities. And I think on a substantive level, Ron, I think we can talk about the SEC invitations that have been made and who's coming to see the commission,
Sure.
and getting feedback from a whole host of people within the crypto ecosystem. So I think of it as more of like there's an executive branch level and there's also an agency level. So I think in the collective, the industry is getting a good opportunity to be heard and make its case.
And David, I'm with you. I don't want to minimize the politics of the imagery and what's happening. And again, I don't mean that necessarily as a negative, but these were donors, and you're right. This is a thank you to donors. Josh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, for those watching at home or at the office, what we're talking about is, I believe, at 1:30 p.m. Eastern is the time when we will have the first, I guess, White House Crypto Summit.
Yes.
So I think that is just for those who are hearing about an event or something like that, or maybe watching this on like after the fact. That's what we're talking about.
Yes, I'll have popcorn and I will be watching enthusiastically, Josh. Josh, David, one of the other things we have to talk about, in full disclosure, we'll be meeting, the three of us, as well as a contingent of members later on in DC with some of the parties you mentioned, including some of the regulators. Really, a lot of the builders keep building, and a lot of the conversation. Josh seems to be waiting on some of the decisions around some of the bigger cases. We've seen multiple cases from the FCC be dismissed. There are a couple of big ones still outstanding. Predominantly is Ripple. Josh, I'm not going to wager you anything. I gave up betting you or David a long time ago. But what does a Ripple dismissal do to the market? And is that something you're anticipating, to the extent you can discuss it?
So, I mean, I certainly don't have any inside information about the Ripple case. What I would just imagine is that, as I think I mentioned last week, I believe, unless I did it in a dream. I think the SEC is generally going to be dismissing these cases and or at least seeking to have them dismissed, right? And sometimes you need commission approval by the commissioners, right? And I think I'm at least aware of certain cases that are maybe crypto adjacent where such kind of an approval hasn't been granted, even though it's been sought.
Right.
But as for like the pure crypto cases, I think we're largely going to continue to see all of the major cases dismissed. Now with Ripple, it's an interesting thing, right? Because there already is a decision that is out there, and who knows whether or how the SEC feels about that decision. And I'm not just talking about the part that said, okay, programmatic sales, blind bid asks, are not transactions in securities, or the part that said, guess what? Used for employee compensation, not securities, other sorts of things, not securities. I'm talking about the yes, but the piece of the Ripple decision that found in favor of the SEC, right? About saying that the initial sales to institutional investors, right? That those involved transactions in securities. What's interesting now is, do we know whether the existing or the current administration actually wants that to stand as law?
Right.
So it's an interesting thing where, it's possible that the case may just, it clearly an appeal was appealed, right? Or the step was taken to appeal before Gary Gensler stepped down. But now, I mean, it's a really interesting question, because even if it goes away, what do we do with that bit of law if, in fact, it may be inconsistent with what the crypto task force or the SEC may take as its position now? I just think it's an interesting question that I don't have an answer for.
Josh, it's a really interesting question, and it really it is astounding the level of detail the three of us and members and others in the industry are kind of peeling back. And let's just say it, Josh. What is a security? And the level of detail now that the regulators in Washington are looking for. David, I want to time travel with you a little bit. As a young man, when you were studying at Penn Law Library, and then you'd later leave to, what was it, the Brown Jug Bar where you'd hold court, David? Would you ever think we'd be having this level of deep dive on, we need an industry to tell us what is or isn't a security?
You know, if we could turn back time, I think a lot of us would have hoped that in that 2017 to 2021 window, that we had spent the time, from an agency perspective, drawing up rules and regulations and really having the conversations that we're having now in Congress. If we had those in 2017, 2018, 2019, I think it would have changed the trajectory of crypto in the US and really in the world. So unfortunately, we're sort of a little bit late to the game. One other thing I'll add is I think Ripple is going to end up settling this case. And again, I don't have any inside knowledge. This is my own speculation. I think, like Josh said, if they want to make sales of certain types, to certain individuals, I think they're going to need to settle this case, because otherwise the underlying law will be problematic if they, want to go public or something like that. So I think that they may ultimately settle the case with the SEC to clear themselves to be able to sell and to act, as they want to as a private entity.
David, and I was correct, was it the Brown Jug Bar?
Well, no, in Michigan, I would say there are a few popular bars, but no Brown Jug one that I recall. But
my sources are error. Josh, go ahead, please.
In for a second and say that for a second, I couldn't stop smiling because I was imagining David with a microphone singing that Cher song.
If I could turn back time.
Oh boy.
Yes, I'm sorry to the
audience.
Boy.
Never have I ever sung that song at karaoke. I can promise you.
Josh and I will take you for another dinner if you would.
Ron, I don't think you can afford the dinner that it would take for.
No, I'm worried about the dinner. I'm worried about the dinner I still owe you.
Yeah, you better watch out. I found an even better place.
David, let's talk a little bit about. Let's stick to this kind of. Let's migrate a little bit. One of the things you and I and Josh have often spoken about is the different market perspectives. And David, one of the things that really struck me looking at market data year to date is this is not an altcoins market. And I want to ask, you and I have talked about this dichotomy between, think Bitcoin, Ether, for example, and the altcoin market. Is the altcoin market dead for this year, David? What is happening in that space?
So it's a great question. And I think the irony is that if you look at all the altcoins, or at least the major altcoins, all of their technology has improved. They've become, they have more market status, they have products, their technology is better, but they're still being discounted like before. In some cases, have totally retraced their gains. The usual playbook would be we'd see a run up in Bitcoin, people take some profits from Bitcoin and roll it into ETH or roll it into altcoins, and that rotation just hasn't happened. And I think part of the reason why it hasn't happened is that the new buyers in Bitcoin aren't buyers who are looking to speculate in altcoins. They're looking to buy a position in Bitcoin or Ether and hold that position, for a longer time frame. So you're not seeing sort of that fast money making a 2x in Bitcoin and then running into altcoins. And so I don't think they're dead. I think that they will have their time in the sun, but it's really a different kind of liquidity that's come in the market, and not one that's like immediately willing to go from Bitcoin gains to Ether to altcoins.
So David, to that point, and then Josh, certainly I would love you to weigh in. This is not fast money you're talking about, correct?
Look, there's an element of fast money that is going into Bitcoin. They're buying the ETFs because they can't buy spot, and then they're selling it and that. But the majority of the new money that's coming into Bitcoin is really, institutional money or personal money wealth management money, and that's not fast money. These aren't people who are looking to like trade in and out of positions. So
Yeah.
I think that liquidity is a different kind of liquidity than that we've seen in the past.
Josh, when the Klayman family office, reallocates on a weekly basis, are you piling into Bitcoin? I'm just curious.
So the Klayman family office. No, but I mean, what I would take it back to what we were talking about with the reserve as
Yep.
well. I think hopefully people will realize that. I realize this doesn't really answer your question at all, Ron. Intentionally so.
No one answers my
But-
questions anymore.
the fact that the U.S. would now have a Bitcoin strategic reserve means that Bitcoin is not being sold, as David noted, but it just contributes to the scarcity,
Mm.
right? Which is really potentially, if you're looking solely at, demand, presumably growing,
Yeah.
and fewer Bitcoins available for purchase,
Mm-hmm.
it bodes well, I would say, in general, not investment advice.
Yes, but it's that's only true though if the government's a buyer of Bitcoin, not with the current Bitcoin that's current. I mean, I think that's part of the problem. There's no clear strategy, David or Josh, that I've seen around. And I'm just going to say it, the use case for a strategic Bitcoin reserve. And we've heard 1,000 different things. It'll pay down debt. It will, whatever that may mean. What am I missing, David or Josh, as far as what an SBR is supposed to do?
Well, I mean, look, I think that's a very fair question. I think the rationale will come over time. At the very least, like we both said, not selling the Bitcoin that we have is advantageous to, we think it's advantageous to, the country, and we think to the, community, we think that's advantageous. I think there are probably some good reasons. And I think over time it'll get fleshed out some more. But look, as long as it's revenue neutral, if we want to diversify our holdings, look, the government could be doing the 1% to 2% in crypto holdings for its balance sheet, like a lot of asset managers are going to be suggesting to their clients. So I'm kind of taking like a more holistic view about it. But I think over time we'll get a better sense, of what people think and how it may be helpful to us.
And I think the three of us generally so many of the colleagues we work with and collaborate with tend to have this longer term perspective. I think it's the speculative mindset that is freaking out about why aren't the prices moving the way they want them. I think, Josh, am I wrong that foundations are being laid for deeper engagement of Bitcoin, for example, in global markets?
I mean, I think that's exactly right, Ron. I would also just say, with respect to the Bitcoin strategic reserve, whether or not it's good for the government, it's good, I would imagine, for Bitcoin holders, right? Because yes, even if the government isn't a buyer, at least it's not a seller.
Right.
Right. And so in that sense, I guess that's the way I was sort of thinking of it. But truly, I guess if one thinks that the US dollar is going to become weaker and weaker, I guess it's a hedge, right?
Yeah. True. David, Josh, go ahead, David.
I was just going to say also that, in the past when the government would confiscate, Bitcoin or other crypto, I think their mandate was to really just sell it right away. They didn't have a mandate to hold on to it. So if nothing else, this is more responsible asset management of an asset that we've confiscated, and we're being more thoughtful about it. I think if you remember, I think it was the city of Cologne in Germany had a certain amount of Bitcoin, and then they just started market selling it and dumping it. When it was around 50 or 60K, if they held on to it, they'd be, see 33 or 55% gain from there. So I think on a basic level, this is just more thoughtful asset management of the Bitcoin that we have, with the opportunity to buy some in revenue neutral ways.
David, I want to throw one more wrinkle into this, and we need to probably get a litigator on as a guest in the future. But one of the articles I had read, looking at the U.S. government holding seized Bitcoin in a strategic Bitcoin reserve, in general, seized assets go to the law enforcement agencies. This is a different turn. And again, the three of us may not have expertise in this, but how does that impact what the government might do with seized Bitcoin?
My view is, if, like, for instance, I think some of the Bitcoin belongs to the Bitfinex holders that, so
Mhm.
if it's proven that some of that Bitcoin belongs to Bitfinex holders, I think it should go to them. Just because something got confiscated, and if you can show that it was yours, you shouldn't lose that just because it was confiscated from, a bad actor. Like, if a bad actor steals your Bitcoin and the government recovers it, you'd like the government to give it back to you because it wasn't your fault that it was taken.
Right.
But
Right.
I don't look, I think there's plenty of other ways for law enforcement to fund themselves rather than the crypto that we may, confiscate. So I'm not fazed by that. I don't know the administrative law part of that
Yeah.
equation like they're mentioning, but I don't think our law enforcement agencies have been, counting on monetizing the Bitcoin to fund their operations.
Yeah, fair point, David. David, Josh, one of the other things we've talked about laying foundations. Obviously, that brings us to the macro conversation. David, I'm sure, like you and I and Josh, we were watching the jobs report, waiting diligently in front of the monitors at 8:29 this morning. And of course, jobs under U.S. jobs undershot estimates. We were supposed to have 160,000 jobs. It came in slightly under 151,000. I don't know if that accounts for some of the government layoffs that have percolated through the economy. Unemployment ticked up. David, in a rational world, you and I might have looked at that and said, well, that means the Fed will probably be cutting interest rates. And now the estimates are maybe even 3 interest rate cuts. And of course, the markets immediately, went off a little bit of a cliff. David, what am I missing in the macro game when we talk about the economy, how that impacts crypto? And one of the things I'm starting to hear that's a little frightening is, are we looking at a contraction in Q1, which means risk off?
Yeah, I think the government's been really clear that they want interest rates to go down,
Yep.
and they are willing to take the steps they think is necessary. And I think Scott Bessent said it, that he's willing to take a little bit of pain and detox us from our spending to get lower interest rates. And lower interest rates are good for crypto, but at the same time, I think because things are uncertain, people are warier of risk assets, and Bitcoin and cryptos are risk assets. And look, we've seen, I think, almost a 10% correction in the NASDAQ in the last
Yeah.
4 weeks. So I think we're seeing, this play out. And the other thing I would say is, again, we're not traders, we just notice market trends, but every time a tariff discussion occurs, crypto sells off. It's literally like on cue.
Yep.
So it's something else that's going on. But I would say, like, the uncertainty in the market and the desire for lower interest rates is really what's driving it, and that's the goal, of Scott Bessa and the administration right now.
So, question for you guys. Like, understood completely that the government wants to have interest rates move lower,
Mhm.
right? And yet, we sometimes hear that the effects, at least in the short term, of the tariffs will be something that looks like inflation,
Right.
right? Or something. So how does this work? Like, is it when you say that Scott Bessent is going to do what it takes and take a little pain to lower interest rates? How does that tie in?
Josh, you have hit at the core of the biggest problem in the macro space, which is in the face of inflation that's particularly sticky. If you lower interest rates, that's going to make inflation worse.
Yeah.
David, weigh in here. Josh, that's the philosophic conversation. Because if that gap between tariffs impacting people raises inflation while we're lowering interest rates, welcome to stagflation, potentially, which is a dangerous thing. David, I cut you off, buddy. Go ahead.
Look, I think ultimately we missed an opportunity to refinance a lot of our debt when the interest rates were low.
Yeah.
And I think that is the goal of the administration, is to get lower interest rates and then to refinance the debt. Because we're hitting up against a debt ceiling, and we're going to have to get some relief to get a budget passed. And I think the goal is get interest rates down, refinance the debt long term at lower rates, and then go back to a more traditional cycle. But you're right, we may see higher prices in the short term. But also remember, the last thing I'd say, Josh, is also remember that this administration wants to use tariffs as a little bit as a saber to get our neighbors or other countries to sort of act in a way that they think is consistent with what we want them to do. And in fairness, I want to say that some of the countries that we are potentially giving tariffs to, aren't letting us compete equally in their market. So there is some imbalance in their trade, deficits between our country and others that should be, remediated. So I would look at it. It's a multidimensional thing. It's not very binary.
Josh, Josh, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, speaking of refinancing, I mean, you guys have, I follow all the sorts of things you guys are sending across, including about the Washington, D.C. housing changes. But also, when I think about refinancing in the context of what you were just saying, it makes me think about commercial real estate and what we've talked about previously, right? Yep. When there have been vacancies, it just makes me think, okay, this is why we're seeing more and more return to office, including not just for banks now, but also for law firms and others.
Right. Yeah, I mean, for commercial property holders, those large corporations, idle capacity is a sunk cost, and their interest rates are not going down enough for them to refinance. I mean, Josh, at a commercial level, I think someone in the audience, correct me if I'm wrong, we're digressing from crypto, but there's something like $800 billion in commercial mortgages and commercial loans that are struggling, as I understand it. Josh, it's different for people like you. My sources tell me you're looking at your 10th property, something like a 30,000 square foot estate someplace. But I will tell you that mortgage rates just came below 7%. So things might open up a little bit, but it'll be interesting to see where it goes. But you're right. Again, Josh, to David's point, there are a lot of moving pieces to this marketplace, and all of that impacts crypto broadly. David, am I wrong?
No, look, you're right. And what's going to play out in DC is going to be very interesting because, people are saying that a lot of more houses that are going on the market. There's statistics to back that out. And then, if we're going to sell some of our, office space, that government buildings that we own, like Washington, D.C. is going to have a real issue. And then, we'll see how that plays out.
And Josh, I hope you don't mind me joking about the 10th property. It's totally in good fun.
I mean, from your mouth to God's ears.
Goodness. Well, thank you both. We're running a little bit out of time. We've got a lot of work to do between now and our trip to Washington. David, Josh, I'm so looking forward to joining both of you and some of our members there. Josh, go ahead.
I wanted to make sure we mentioned one of the things, which is the SEC v. I guess Pulse Chain and Richard Hart this season. I just thought it was worth mentioning.
It is.
Because the decision actually reminded me a little bit of that footnote in Hester Peirce's, or rather the staff guidance about meme coins, where it said, marketing to increase price isn't enough. Like saying you're going to list on an exchange isn't enough. I just thought it was very interesting that in this SEC v. Pulse Chain case, a federal court found that actually, just because there were online statements and just because some U.S. persons purchased in the transactions, that wasn't enough to show that the project was targeting folks in the U.S. And I think that is very instructive for those of us who are counseling clients or otherwise participating in the market. And because of that, the federal court ruled that the SEC didn't have jurisdiction, which is so interesting.
Yes.
And that is a marked shift from what it was, call it a year ago, call it 6 months ago, Josh, in what is or isn't a solicitation, for example. David, go ahead, weigh in.
No, listen, Josh, that's a huge point. And I think that there was a flawed legal strategy in the past that even if there's one statement that was made by somebody who might not even have been, a high level person in the company, that made one statement that might have talked about being listed on an exchange or a good opportunity, like literally one statement would be enough for the commission to latch onto that in the past and bring an action. And look, no company is perfect. Individuals aren't perfect, with X and things like that. This communication is so rapid that I always felt that was very punitive on the part of the commission as far as when they thought about bringing action. So I'm really happy to see that. And I think people would agree with that viewpoint.
Josh, David, thanks so much. Josh, David, we are just about out of time. I would have scheduled a watch party for us for 1:30. Unfortunately, life and meetings have gotten in the way. David, will you be watching the SBF interview this weekend? The recording?
I do want to watch that. Like the little bit I've heard is that it doesn't sound like SBF is very repentant about what's happened. And I do want to say one thing, and other people have mentioned this.
Yep.
You know, a lot of the money in value that they were gambling with was really like liquidations that they would force on customers, you know, and sometimes those liquidations were proper, and I think sometimes they weren't. So, you know, it's interesting that SBF is looking to rehabilitate his image to try and get a pardon. But, you know, I've really only heard it secondhand, but I'm looking forward to watching it.
Josh?
Yeah, I mentioned just one thing before we go, which is my recollection, and I believe this is true because I also was just Googling furiously to figure out if I'm correct. But I believe that one of the co-counsel in the Pulse Chain case was our very good friend Klayman Siddiqui.
Oh,
great. Shout out to Kayvon. Great man.
Oh, shout out to Kayvon.
Brilliant legal mind. And David, I don't know if you noticed, like you and I are half joking about SBF interviews. Josh is like doing real thinking about real cases. So just you know, if I go off the rails,
give credit where it's due.
Right? Look, you know, Ron, when I was practicing, this was a big issue. Like when we were giving advice, we would be literally combing years of ex post and marketing materials just to see if there was anything out there that, you know, could be problematic. So, I mean, it really, you can't imagine the amount of work and time and legal fees that were incurred by companies really going back and doing that diligence to determine whether they had exposure.
Yeah, and just on that point, just for one second, I mean, clients would say like, okay, so I just want to post this, I'll tweet this or whatever. And you have to be like, no, it's going on social media. It might flow into the US. You need a disclaimer. You know, like all these sorts of things, which I'm not saying that that's still not potentially a good idea if you're trying to exclude people to say, hey, by the way, these people are excluded. Yeah. But I think this was a big decision.
I think a lot of people underestimate how much effort goes into the work lawyers do. I am not a lawyer. My father wanted me to be a lawyer, Josh, but I spent a lot of time with lawyers. So David, Josh, let's leave it there. There's going to be so much more to cover. For everyone in the audience, again, thank you all so much for joining us. If you've got additional questions that we didn't get to or suggested topics for next week, because I give up doing an agenda, Josh, email us info@wsba.co. We'll definitely make sure it gets there. David, we'll get you a new camera. Everyone's already complaining about not seeing you or hiding you behind a curtain. Josh, David, let's leave it there. Everyone, thank you for joining. Have a great weekend. We'll see you next week.
Have a great
Thanks,
weekend.
everybody.
Bye.